What darkness can possess a mother's heart? What abyss opens up inside a soul, so vast, so cold, that it can extinguish the very life it brought into this world? It's almost unthinkable. A mother, the source of life, of nurture, of unconditional love. To become the architect of unimaginable cruelty. How can that be? How can the purest bond become so twisted, so corrupted, that it leads to ultimate betrayal? What happens when the very person meant to protect becomes the source of unimaginable terror? What are we left to believe? What are we left to fear? These are the questions that haunt this case. Welcome to Crime Stories Network. I thank you, my viewers, for your support as we keep bringing true crime stories, especially against children abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Please don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Let me tell you about Mahali Hobs. Imagine a little girl, just 5 years old. Picture her bright eyes, full of curiosity and mischief. Those who knew her described her as joyful. A spark of pure, unadulterated light. Her laughter, they said it was infectious. The kind of sound that could light up a whole room. You know the sound. The sound of pure, innocent happiness. She loved to play, like any 5-year-old. Loved cartoons, bright colors, and the simple joys of childhood. She had a favorite teddy bear, a fluffy brown one she named Patches, that went everywhere with her. Her grandmother, who adored her, remembers those video calls. Maha's face would fill the screen, all smiles and excited chatter, showing off her toys, telling stories in that sweet, high-pitched voice only a child has. She was a granddaughter cherished, a niece adored, a little girl, loved. But even in the brightest lives, shadows can creep in. Even in the most loving families, darkness can sometimes find a way. Maha lived with her mother, Alexis Nelson. To the outside world, perhaps, they seemed like any other family. But behind closed doors, life for Maha was not always filled with sunshine and laughter. There were rumors, worries, etc., things that cannot be seen or uttered. Signs of trouble, things appear to be flashing red lights in retrospect. But at the time, were easily missed. Easily ignored. And then, the video calls stopped. The grandmother grew worried. Days turned into weeks. Silence, where there used to be Maha's bright voice. An unsettling silence, that grew louder and louder in her grandmother's heart. A silence, that would ultimately lead to the discovery of a horror no one could have imagined. A horror, that began, not in a stranger's lair, but in the one place a child should always be safe, her own home. With her own mother. And what about Maha's mother, Alexis Nelson? Like anyone, Alexis had her own story. Hopes, dreams, a life she envisioned for herself. But life, as it often does, had dealt her a difficult hand. She carried a complex history, a weight of past traumas that shaped her, molded her, in ways we are only now beginning to understand. By the time Maha was born, Alexis was facing immense pressure. She was a young, single mother, navigating the challenges of parenthood largely on her own. Isolated. Emotionally and financially strained. Those who knew her describe a woman struggling. A woman who seemed overwhelmed by the responsibilities of motherhood. A woman perhaps, afraid to ask for help. Afraid of judgment. Afraid of failing. We can try to imagine the pressures she was under. The exhaustion, the loneliness, the sheer weight of responsibility. We can try to understand the path that led her to that terrible place. Perhaps, if we try hard enough, we might even glimpse a flicker of empathy for a woman clearly struggling. A woman who may have been lost, adrift, and desperately in need of support herself, but even as we acknowledge the complexities of Alexis's life, even as we try to understand the struggle she faced, there is a line. A line that should never be crossed. A line that Alexis Nelson tragically, irrevocably, obliterated. Because while Alexis's story might elicit some empathy, we must not, excuse her actions. What happened to Maha was not a lapse in judgment. It was not a moment of weakness. It was a deliberate act. An act of unimaginable cruelty. And the truth of what she did is far more horrifying than anyone could have anticipated. Maha wasn't alone in the world, even though in her final days, she may have felt utterly isolated. She had a father, Mahali Hobs. Though he and Alexis were no longer together, Mahali loved his daughter. From a distance, he tried to be a part of Maha's life. Tried to provide. Tried to be a father, even when circumstances made it difficult. Later, Mahali would wrestle with guilt. With the agonizing question of, what if? What if he had done more? What if he had seen the signs? What if he had been there? Could he have changed things? Could he have saved her? These are the questions that haunt any parent who has lost a child, especially in such a horrific way. The unanswered what-ifs that echo in the silence, but perhaps the most persistent voice of concern, the one that ultimately set the wheels of discovery in motion, was that of Maha's grandmother, Asia. She loved Maha fiercely. Cherished their video calls. Treasured every moment she spent with her bright, bubbly granddaughter. And when those calls stopped, a cold dread began to settle in her heart. Weeks went by. Silence from Alexis. Excuses that felt increasingly thin, increasingly hollow. Asia tried to reach Maha, again and again. No answer. Just silence. That silence, it became unbearable. It was a silence that screamed louder than any shout. A silence that told Asia, in the pit of her stomach, that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Driven by a grandmother's intuition, a love that refused to be ignored, Asia made a decision. A decision that would shatter the carefully constructed facade. A decision that would pull back the curtain on a nightmare unfolding in plain sight. Asia called the police. She asked for a welfare check. Unknowing, perhaps, but with a mother's heart's certainty. She set in motion the events that would finally reveal the unimaginable truth of what had happened to Mahali Hobs. When the Aurora Police Department officers arrived at Alexis Nelson's apartment that day, they were there for a welfare check. A routine call, or so it seemed at first. They knocked on the door. Alexis answered. She appeared calm, composed. To the officers, she seemed normal. Asia's worry, Alexis explained, was just a misunderstanding. Maha was fine, she said. In fact, Maha wasn't even here. Alexis told them she had made a difficult but ultimately loving choice. She had given Maha up for adoption. Just a month ago, she claimed. To a family in another state. Everything was handled through a private agency, she said. A closed adoption. All very proper, very legal. But something didn't quite add up. Details were vague. Inconsistencies started to surface almost immediately. When officers pressed for the name of the adoption agency, Alexis hesitated. She gave it a name, Janet Dunn Adoption Services. But when detectives checked, there was no record of any such agency. No Janet Dunn. No record of Mahali Hobs. The story began to unravel. Quickly. Detectives started digging deeper. They looked at Alexis's online activity. And there, in her search history, they found something chilling. Searches for overdose from melatonin and Xanax. A disturbing search history. For a mother who claimed her child was safe and well. This wasn't the behavior of a loving parent who had made a responsible adoption plan. This was something else. Something far more troubling. Then, they spoke to a maintenance worker at the apartment complex. He remembered something odd. About a month prior, he'd been called to fix a door in Alexis's apartment. He'd noticed something strange. The bedroom door, locked. Locked not with a key, but with a rope. A rope tied to the bedroom door handle, and then stretched across the hall, to the bathroom door handle, locking it from the outside. Locked from the outside. Who locks a child's bedroom door? From the outside, the pieces were starting to fall into place. A false adoption story. Disturbing internet searches. A locked bedroom door. A growing sense of dread settled over the detectives. They knew, with a sickening certainty, that Maha was not with an adoption agency. They knew. They had to search the apartment. Thoroughly, they started with the utility closet on the patio. As they approached, a smell hit them first. Faint at first. But then unmistakable. The cloying, sickeningly sweet odor, of decomposing flesh. Their stomachs tightened. Their hearts began to race. They knew, in that instant. This was not going to be a routine welfare check. This was, something horrific, with a sense of dread. They opened the door. And stepped into a nightmare. Alexis Nelson's calm phony finally crumbled. Faced with the undeniable horror discovered in her utility closet, she was arrested. The charges were swift and severe: first-degree murder, child abuse resulting in death, tampering with a deceased human body, and attempting to influence a public servant. A list of accusations that painted a grim picture of calculated cruelty in a desperate attempt to evade responsibility. The arrest brought a measure of relief, perhaps. A sense that finally, accountability would be demanded. But for Maha's family, for Terrell and Asia, the pain was still raw, still agonizing. Knowing the who and the how didn't lessen the crushing weight of why. Why Maha? Why this unimaginable horror? Those questions would likely linger forever. The legal process moved forward. Months turned into a year. The case against Alexis Nelson proceeded through the courts. Initially, she pleaded not guilty. Her defense team hinted at potential mental health issues, suggesting a woman overwhelmed and broken by life's challenges. But the evidence was overwhelming. The charred remains of Maha. The disturbing internet searches. The locked bedroom door. The lies. It all pointed in one direction. Toward Alexis, and her unthinkable actions. Faced with the mountain of evidence, and perhaps recognizing the futility of denial, Alexis Nelson eventually made a decision. She agreed to a plea deal. In exchange for pleading guilty to second-degree murder, tampering with a deceased human body, and attempting to influence a public servant, the prosecution agreed to drop the first-degree murder charge. A deal that avoided a potentially lengthy and emotionally grueling trial for Maha's family. A deal that still meant decades behind bars for Alexis Nelson. In court, the sentence was handed down. 84 years in prison. Decades to contemplate the enormity of her actions. Decades to face the consequences of her choices. For second-degree murder, 48 years. For tampering with a deceased human body, 12 years. For attempting to influence a public servant, 24 years. Consecutive sentences. 84 years. For a life. Snuffed out at just 5 years old. For Terrell and Asia, it was something. Not justice, perhaps, not in its truest form. Nothing could ever bring Maha back. But it was accountability. A recognition by the legal system of the profound wrong that had been committed. A sentence. That meant Alexis Nelson would spend a significant portion of her life paying for what she had done. But even with the sentencing, the emptiness remained. The questions lingered. And the shadow of Maha's tragic death would forever darken the lives of those who loved her. 84 years. A lifetime behind bars. But even with the sentence, the question that lingered, the question that perhaps haunts this case most deeply, remained: why? What could drive a mother to such an act? What chain of events, what internal struggles, could lead to such unspeakable horror? In court, Alexis Nelson's defense team attempted to offer some context. They painted a picture of a woman deeply scarred by her own childhood. They spoke of trauma, of neglect, of a young life marked by instability and pain. They argued that these experiences had profoundly shaped Alexis, leaving her emotionally vulnerable, ill-equipped to cope with the immense pressures of motherhood. They suggested that she was not a monster, but a broken woman who made a monstrous choice. The defense narrative hinted at a tragic breakdown. A woman pushed to her breaking point. A mother who felt overwhelmed, desperate, and ultimately lost control. They suggested that while her actions were undeniably horrific, they were perhaps understandable, in the context of her own deeply troubled past. A plea for, if not forgiveness, then perhaps understanding. But the prosecution countered this narrative. They acknowledged Alexis's difficult past. They didn't deny her struggles. But they argued that trauma, while it can wound deeply, does not negate personal responsibility. They pointed out that Alexis had choices. That resources were available. That help was within reach, if she had only sought it. They argued that her actions were not simply a tragic breakdown, but a series of deliberate choices that culminated in the death of her own child. The prosecution emphasized agency, choice, responsibility. They argued that while a difficult past can explain, it cannot excuse. That society cannot, must not, accept child murder as a consequence of personal trauma. That there are lines that cannot be crossed, regardless of circumstance. And that Alexis Nelson had crossed that ultimate line, and in the end. That is the agonizing truth at the heart of this case. A mother's tragic breakdown, yes. Alexis Nelson's trauma, undeniably, had shaped her. But that did not justify her actions. It did not bring Maha back. And it does not erase the fundamental, heartbreaking reality, that a 5-year-old girl died at the hands of the one person who was supposed to love and protect her most. A moral ambiguity that leaves us grappling with uncomfortable truths, and the enduring, devastating question, how could this have happened? This case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about mental health, about social support systems, about the hidden struggles of parents, and about the devastating consequences when those systems fail. Let Maha's tragedy be a catalyst. Let it inspire us to be more vigilant, more compassionate, more proactive in protecting children in our own communities. To offer help, not judgment. To build stronger safety nets. To ensure that no other child suffers such a horrific fate. Take a moment now, to think about the world around you. Think about the children in your life. Think about the families who may be struggling in silence. And ask yourself, what can you do? How can you make a difference? How can you help prevent another tragedy like this from ever happening again? Thank you for watching. If you found this video impactful, please like and subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories that shed light on important issues. Share this video to help raise awareness. And let's all commit to creating a safer world for every child.